Okay, good afternoon. If you're in Western Europe, good later afternoon, stroke early evening in South Africa and other variants to other parts of the world. And welcome to this GLACIER seminar. GLACIER is our comparative international education group in Glasgow. We're running 3 events over the next couple of weeks about the interface between research and policy, getting people who work across those spaces. It's a real genuine pleasure to start this with a session from Professor Stephanie Allais, who I have worked with for over 2 decades. And even before that time, Steph was, working in, as a teacher, both in primary and secondary. Like me, one of the few people who've done both of those, and adult ed and union education work, who's worked in NGOs, in distance ed, if I remember, and also for the government in terms of the Umalusi, the Further Education Qualifications Council of South Africa, has been seconded to ILO, has been special advisor to the Minister of Higher Education and Training South Africa. So a huge range of work across the policy and practice space, as well as her academic work. She holds a National Research Foundation stroke South African Research Chairs Initiative Chair in skills development at the University of Witswatersrand. Has published several books, many papers around knowledge, curriculum, qualifications, around educational policy and practice, and is co-editor of the Journal of Vocational Education and Training. I could go on for much longer, but then we wouldn't get to hear Steph. So if I can hand over to you.
Thanks, Simon, and lovely to be here this afternoon. And I don't have a lot of slides actually, but I did like this one because of my title, Why Policy is Not Just Collective Hallucination, which I will reflect on a little bit during the course of the presentation. But this is just to give a quick picture. The picture's a little bit out of date, but just so that everyone can get a sense of some of the people at the Centre for Researching Education and Labour, and a little bit about the research that we do at the Centre for Researching Education and Labour. I think it is quite a unique research centre internationally. And so, yeah, we'd really love anyone who's interested to get in touch and learn more about our work or work with us. I'm going to talk about 5 main sets of issues today, starting a little bit with the context from which I speak, and what that means for thinking about, so the fact that I'm talking from the Global South and my research is in and on the Global South, and focusing on educational preparation for work and youth unemployment, what the implications of that are for thinking about this interface between policy and research that I have been working in for many years. And then I want to talk very briefly about some of the failed policies and what we think of as evidence for failure. Now, obviously, there could be contestation about this, but I don't really want to go in too much into detail of that now. We could have a separate debate, and I'm very happy to share references later. But then the real issue that I want us to kind of reflect on is, why do policymakers stick with policies that actually don't seem to have much evidence in their favor? And that's what I'd really like us to have some discussion and reflection on today. And then what we as researchers can learn from this problem of the policy research interface, from the problems that confront policymakers and why the issues that confront them are actually quite complicated. And how can we try to make the research policy interface work a bit less poorly, or maybe even make it work well? Although that last bit is really what I hope we're going to be jointly reflecting on. So I am going to, at this point, stop sharing. Did it stop sharing? Because I want to actually be able to see people and talk to people, and I don't want to be too focused on the PowerPoint notes. So anyone who wants to turn their camera on, do feel free so that we can actually make this more of a real engagement. And if you don't want to put your camera on because you're actually cooking while you're listening, then you don't need PowerPoint slides anyway. So that's another reason why I thought it would be better to just talk and not be dependent on the slides. Okay, so the context, as I said, to start with in the first section, and as I said, I want to foreground two aspects of context to locate how I'm entering the world of education, international development, and the policy research interface, which this seminar series is looking at. So the first is that I'm speaking from the Global South and I research on the Global South. And there's two significant differences about the research policy interface from the Global North that I want to highlight. Obviously, there's more than two, and I'm not going to go into the most obvious one about the difference in terms of resources, both for research and for policy development and implementation. But the two that I really wanted to highlight is, firstly, in the world of researching, evaluating, analyzing policy, engaging with policymakers, we in the Global South don't just deal with government, industry, and worker organizations as people would, which would be the main people that you would engage with if you were researching skills and vocational education in the Global North. We also engage with international organizations, donors, and development agencies. Now, of course, many Global North researchers also work with these organizations, but they work with them in terms of shaping what they do to our countries, as opposed to our situation in which they're actually an additional and often very powerful voice in a complex mix of policy actors who are all engaging in the policy development and implementation space in our world. The second is that we have a close and ongoing working relationship with policymakers. Now, that isn't the case in all countries, but it certainly is in many African countries, and it certainly is in South Africa. So, I know that educational researchers in the Global North often lament that government just ignores them, and it's difficult to get them to the table. And actually, in the Global South, that isn't the case. So we actually have a lot of interface with policymakers. We work very closely with them all the time. We do research for them. We're involved in actual policy development. We do evaluations. We do research that isn't for them, but has implications for them. And we then present at their events and so on. So it's a very active and ongoing engagement. So it sounds great so far, right? But actually, in many cases, they seem unable to hear what we're saying, or maybe unable to do anything with it. And that's what I want us to reflect on. It's this dynamic that I really want us to talk about today when I'm talking about the challenges from both sides of building more productive conversations in the education policy interface. And then the second part of the context is obviously that my research is in the area of vocational education, youth unemployment, educational preparation for work, which includes schools, skills training, and in all of these, we find a pervasiveness of magical thinking. And magical thinking is really what informed the notion of collective hallucination in my title. Initially, I played with various iterations of the title, including policy is collective hallucination. Why is policy collective hallucination? And in the end, I chose why policy is not just collective hallucination. I think there is a degree of magical thinking, but it's not just that. There's other problems that we need to get at. And what I don't want you to come away with is the impression that I'm here to critique policymakers. Actually, I want to reflect on the complexities of this interface, where it seems to go wrong, and to try to think about how to get it less wrong, or even, as I said, a little bit right. And some of the key policies that I'm thinking about in our space include competence-based training and occupational standards as the key mechanisms for reforming vocational education and making it workplace relevant. Quality assurance regimes as ways to improve quality. Qualifications, frameworks, and micro-credentials as tools for mobility, articulation, and quality. And more broadly, skills interventions and entrepreneurship training as key interventions for youth employment. The idea of vocationalizing the school curriculum as a solution to youth unemployment and economic stagnation, and many other ideas that remain pervasive over time for decades and decades. As Simon said, we've been working together for decades on these issues. So, many of us have spent many years researching the failures of many policies in these areas. And as I said, I can't go into why these policies fail or even my evidence for why they should be regarded as failures. And some of you on the call may want to dispute that. I think the evidence is actually quite convincing, but obviously there's always room for debate. I just want to I'm moving on to the second section of the presentation. One quick taste into one of those areas that I mentioned above, a quick spin through the world of competence-based training and occupational standards, because I think it offers quite clear examples of this, a quite clear example of this phenomenon of a policy that's developed, implemented, doesn't do what it says it's going to do, gets abandoned in one country but developed in the next country, abandoned in that country, developed in the next country. So as a technology to reform vocational education, as many of you know, it starts in the UK with the idea of standards of a new kind introduced to reform VET under Thatcher. And the idea was employers will look at the tasks that they want staff or need staff to perform in workplaces. They will turn these tasks into standards in a process called functional analysis. These standards can then be given to education providers. The education providers will develop relevant training programs because they will have the standard from the people who need the standard, the employers. Providers can then apply for funding. Learners can apply to be assessed if they believe they're already competent. So these ideas are very pervasive in our space. They didn't work in that first iteration in the UK. There's a ton of research. I'm really happy to share references demonstrating problems at a whole range of different levels. To mention a few, employers didn't actually get involved. The standards were not developed by employers, and that is one of the problems that is most repeats from country to country. Young people weren't attracted to the qualifications. Employers didn't hire people who had the qualifications. There's many. But more significantly for my purpose here today, despite these failures, the policy technology was adopted in Australia as a key mechanism for the privatisation of vocational education. So in Australia, the idea was that because the standards, which were going to be specified by the employers, would be widely available, government could provide funding to any training provider that could train against these standards. My colleagues Lisa Wheelahan and Gavin Moody have just recently published a paper on how that affected vocational education. It's a really, really useful overview. It's published in the JVET. I encourage you to all go and have a look at it. Their paper gives an overview of the research. There's a plethora of research, corruption scandals, hollowing out of public provision, and many other problems. Not to say that there were no successes. And of course, some of the successes may be things that are not officially evaluated as successes, but might have been what behind the original policy intent. This is why I don't want the AI recording, you see. Like people might have originally been pushing it because they wanted to make a profit out of it, and they did make a profit out of it. But anyway, our Australian colleagues can share their thoughts on that. I know we've got Paul Common on the call, who I know has got lots of thoughts on this. But if you fast forward for 50 years, competence-based training is like the Terminator, constantly coming back from the dead just when you think it's finally been defeated. I think the word competence is part of the answer to why, because it's kind of inconceivable to think of any vocational program that isn't aimed at making people competent. Obviously, we want people to be competent. And one of the hallucinatory or magical thinking aspects of policy is that people seem to think that a given policy magically does what it says on the label. So if it's called competence-based education, obviously it makes people competent. And if you're opposed to it, you must somehow be opposed to making people competent. So let's be really specific about competence-based training. Of course, you could have VET that's aimed at competence that isn't competence-based training. It's not a magical way of making learners competent. Neither are occupational standards a magical way of ensuring that VET programs meet the needs of occupations or have appropriate standards. What they are is a policy technology with two key related components. The first is a curriculum component, the idea that employers specify standards. So this is the same with occupational standards that then can be taught against. And from a governance and funding point of view, that these standards can be used to govern educational reform and allocate funding, which is why it becomes a very handy tool for privatization for those governments who are that way inclined. Or contractualization, which is more what we see on the African continent, for governments that don't actually privatize, but they treat their own institutions as if there are market providers. Now, as I've said, particularly in low and middle income countries, there's lots of evidence of failure, empirical evidence. There's very little evidence of empirical success, even by the people who are pushing these kinds of reforms. But policy is complex, and this is part of the problem, right? It's always so easy to say, yeah, but they didn't do it right. It was implemented wrong. The organization was corrupt. The people were incompetent. And what's quite fascinating to me about competence-based training in particular is that every reformer of vocational education tells you that the previous system, the one that they are now replacing, was an employer-led system. Was not an employer-led system, and therefore its programs were not relevant. And this time they're going to start by asking employers what competences they need. But when you dig deeper, you usually find that the system that they were replacing said the same thing about itself and tried to do the same thing. Why? Because it's actually a really difficult thing, firstly, to find out from employers what they need. Secondly, to develop education and training curricula that meet that. Thirdly, to run complex educational systems based on that as a policy tool. So much of the research that's available also explains or demonstrates not just that there's an empirical lack of evidence, but also that there are conceptual flaws inherent. These policies are not going to achieve their goals. For practical reasons, as shown first in the work of Alison Wolfe in the UK, who showed that employers are diverse, even in the same industry, big companies, small companies need different things, employers don't actually participate, and many more conceptual problems to do with the nature of knowledge and expertise, to do with labor markets and how credentials function in labor markets. So not only have the policies not worked, but when you stop to analyze them and dissect them conceptually, they actually can't work. Many of us on the call today have written many policies and papers about this. I'm really happy to share any of them. But what I want to emphasize here is that in the global north, what tends to happen with this kind of policy is that you've got strong institutions that kind of have a this too will pass attitude to policy reform and manage to survive it. In the global north, policies that don't work are worse than failed policies. They don't just not work, they hide problems, they absorb resources, they sell false dreams, they lead to reforms that are about privatization, individualization, pathologizing of individuals and or countries, always putting education as the rescue to economic problems, but in particular in the vet space in Africa, lead to a plethora of busy work that isn't actually engaging in the real economy. And that's partly what makes it feel like when I work in this space, either there's some kind of collective hallucination that people just keep doing it, or that I'm hallucinating. And if we're going to assume, which I'm going to do for now, that neither of these two are the case, and also we're going to assume that individuals working in governments, donors, development agencies are intelligent, committed, hardworking on average as everyone else, and that they're not all neoliberals trying to privatize everything, then we have a dislocation that has to be explained. So what I want to turn to now, and I'd also love to hear all of your ideas on it when I finish, is not just why these specific policies have failed, but rather why they continue to be pushed despite a lack of empirical evidence or conceptual rigor in their favor. Because I think understanding that second half is essential to doing things differently. So now moving on to the third part of the talk. Nearly halfway through, guys, and the last two bits are quicker. I've already mentioned the tendency to believe that a policy does what's in the label. You know, a quality assurance system will assure quality, despite any actual evidence. I've never seen any evidence that a quality assurance system has improved or assured quality. Of course, another issue is ideology. And of course, some of the policies that are pushed have other agendas. Privatization is a huge one. And pathologizing individuals when governments don't want to intervene in economies is a huge one. So instead of saying there's a structural problem in our economy that is not generating jobs, you say there's something missing in our young people. But if we could just fix that and make sure they have the right skills, then they'll no longer be unemployed. Okay, but this doesn't take away from the number of people who believe in these policies who are not evil neoliberals in most cases. Another reason for why policies continue to be pushed is sometimes the same reforms go by different names, and sometimes the same terms are used for a whole lot of different policy interventions. And of course, we know that the successful vocational education systems that everyone wants to imitate in the German-speaking countries and other Northern European-speaking countries do have occupational standards. And those occupational standards play an important role, and they do build competence, and that's a really important part of them. But what we tend to see is that policymakers take little bits of what they see in successful systems without understanding the whole system. And that's not just local policymakers, but also the donors and development agencies who are advising them. So classically, you look at Germany, you see that youth unemployment is low. And what does Germany have? An apprenticeship system. Okay, well, if we make sure that people learn on the job and at work, then we'll have an apprenticeship system. And then our vocational education system will also prevent youth unemployment. So partly this is because of an implicit assumption, I think, this is my analysis, that by policymakers, that the world is complicated instead of complex. So complicated is a toaster, a microwave, a laptop. It can be very complicated and very, lots of different parts, and all of them need to work to make the thing work. But each part can be isolated. And in a world in which each part can be isolated, we can fix the individual parts on their own. Now, of course, policy has to be a simplification from the world. It has to be abstracted from the messiness of the real world in the same way that any theoretical account of the social world is a simplification and abstraction. And policymakers operate in a very complex world, and most of them can only engage in one area of intervention. But the problem is two things. The first is this tendency to think of the world as complicated instead of complex. And the second is, and this is the second point, my second point of analysis based on reflecting on many years of working in this space, the tendency for policy to become a self-contained world. Because that's when learning becomes impossible. When policy becomes a little projection of the world and it's completely separated from the messy world of reality that it's trying to change. And I think that this happens very often. It sounds absurd, but it actually, when you look at a lot of research, this is how policy is treated. And a lot of research makes it worse. So here I'm looking at RCTs, because what do RCTs do? They attempt to isolate individual variables. So, treating the world as if it's complicated. Did the dependent variables change based on this the variable that we tried to change. So, but beyond RCTs, many policy evaluations and academic studies remain at the level of collecting little pieces of data that don't feed into a coherent view of the phenomenon under investigation, because They think that you can isolate the different parts, or they focus on understanding how each piece of policy relates to itself as a kind of internal coherence in relation to, how does the policy aim to achieve its objectives? Instead of measuring how the policy actually achieves its real world goals or impacts on people. And all of this ignores how actors and relationships in the real world change and adapt in response to changes in a system, which then plays into a tendency for policy to be seen in a self-contained world. We get a lot of calls for research proposals that are really asking us to look at the policy as the policy. How was the policy designed? Has the policy been implemented? How has the policy been, but not actually, do we have any indication at all about if the policy achieved its goals? So the challenge is improving this interface. Theory, policy, and data. Otherwise, we can't learn and build robust knowledge about change. So the fourth part of my talk is the bit that I called "It's obvious, but it's not obvious." Because we know as researchers, the biggest question that confronts us daily is, how do we know what our data is telling us? The relationship between data, theory, and analysis is really difficult. But data has to penetrate theories. Theories have to make sense of data. And it's only in that interface that we learn and build knowledge. Theory is also a simplification of the world. But good theories start from the idea of complexity, not complicatedness. Good theories look at patterns, relationships, and ideas. And complex is where the different parts interact with each other in unpredictable ways. This is why I have been very attracted to researching skill formation systems, the political economy of skills, but also more recently getting involved in looking at skills ecosystems. And all of these approaches take a systems approach that don't see the world as you can change this and everything else will change, but rather a complex world in which there's no independent levers that can be fixed or pulled. Now, the quagmire of policymakers in the area of skills and youth unemployment is that, now I'm moving on to the last section, I'm nearly done, Simon. In the area of skills and youth unemployment, each policymaker has to make policy in relation to specific things. So they have to behave as if it's a complicated world, and that's all they can really do. And all that policymakers can do is make policy. Donors and development agencies then get caught in a trap. Either they do interventions, which tend to then be a training program that benefits 300 learners, and then they do an RCT to say, did those learners get a job in any way that was different to the control group? Or they support policymakers. But as soon as they support policymakers in the hope that they can achieve more systemic change, they often get caught up in the trap of the self-referential policy world that is disconnected from reality. And it's so tempting to get busy adding to, augmenting, revising the policies without engaging in the real world. So for me, that's the thing that we have to find ways of penetrating, and particularly in the global South context. If we want systemic change, we have to find ways of penetrating where policy is crystallized into a self-contained world that exists in its own right. And in our context, there are many of those. And also in our context, the challenges are really real. And they're real everywhere in the global North as well. Rising youth unemployment is a crisis everywhere. In Africa, we have the so-called learning poverty crisis, which is actually a poverty crisis, which means that people can't learn. But anyway, some of the donors like to call it a learning poverty crisis to draw attention away from its economic roots. We have migration crises shaped by education and labor markets that are changing in many countries around the world, exacerbated by famine and drought, political crises. And we have a set of policies to reform vocational education and training and skills that are ineffectual, that have been implemented for 50 years. And as researchers, we're facing a new kind of hallucination, which I only discovered quite recently from the world of AI, where if you ask AI to give you an overview of knowledge on a particular thing, not only does it make that up based on what it regards as the best synthesis of knowledge in the field, it even makes up the references, which I did not know. So it literally hallucinates. And that makes our job that much harder, because I've already come across an example of a published paper in an academic journal referencing a hallucinated paper that does not exist, written by someone that I know. So, when policymakers want research that bolsters the things that they want to do because they're easier to do, because they believe in them for whatever reason, there's going to be more and more research that actually does that. So that's kind of irritating. But I think that in that irritation, there are ideas for routes to alternatives. And I do believe that to find these alternatives, we have to continue to look at what's wrong. At a conference a few years ago, a colleague from Switzerland challenged me, and she said to me, "Why do you keep presenting on everything that's going wrong?" And, we don't only want to do that. Actually, we are currently working on a very exciting research project where we're really going into companies and trying to look at the ways in which they are thinking about skills planning, skills utilization, to try and help to develop policy systems that go right, or go a little bit more right. But I do think we have to keep looking not only at what's wrong, because they keep being wrong policies keep being implemented, but also at why well-intentioned non-neoliberal policymakers keep adopting policy models that have very little chance of achieving their key goals. And so I think looking at what's wrong in this way also does show us where we can start to move and how we can start to think differently if we can hold these things together, and if we can find ways of bringing the notion of complexity to policymakers in ways that doesn't make their work impossible to do, because it's really difficult when you are trying to change policy and change how policy is implemented in a poor resource-strapped country. So I'll end there, Simon, because you said 25 minutes, and I really am keen to hear from others what they think about these issues, if they disagree with me, if they have other ideas about why policies keep getting implemented that don't actually have any evidence in their favor.
Thank you so much, Steph. I was asked to be a respondent. I'm not going to be a South African respondent and say how it's all CAC. And actually, I'm going to do something very short, because Steph and I are working together on this issue, so we could go on for hours of agreeing on some stuff and disagreeing on it. But there's just a couple of things out of that rich presentation that I just want to, in a sense, more highlight as kind of reflections. I think this question, you've historically come to a different knowledge question, but I think some of the knowledge questions that are in there are really challenging for us as a field. The AI one, it's great. It's improved my academic productivity. All these new papers that I didn't know I'd written. It's wonderful. But I was presenting in Switzerland the week before last on similar things, and people saying, but is it that there isn't evidence for these things, or is there evidence they haven't worked? And that's sometimes a challenge for us, is there actually isn't evidence for things either working or not working. That's still pretty shocking when you've had a policy for decades that you can't find any evidence for it. But I think that one of those, when you look at the bigger trends over the decades, is the shift that happened the late 90s towards sector-wide policy support and partnerships and budgetary support, which all said, yeah, we should leave countries in charge, country in the driving seat, all the donors should contribute, and that will be national policy. But as you say, that then led to evaluations, and certainly, when I was involved in things, to yes, well, we've got a policy, so therefore we've succeeded, against, again, other experiences of working for agencies, and there's a well outlined theory of change or a logical framework or whatever, but then you're asked, what are you going to count? And it's, well, yeah, we train 300 women. And if it's women, that's of course better than men. in many, because then you're hitting multiple targets of an agency. And so I remember, sitting working for GIZ, and it's, we don't care about the theory of change. What we want to know is, can you show that we've trained 500 people? And so these real tensions about what counts as knowledge, what counts as evidence for or against something, I think is really interesting. But I am going to open it out to the room, where, because we're using Teams, we're kind of in these two spaces. There's a question and answer function, which I'm not seeing anything in. And there's also the chat function. So if I could encourage people to be putting things in the questions and answer function, I think is our way of proceeding, because
can you not unmute people who want to talk?
But my challenge is, or some way of being able to see who that is, because I've got 6 screens worth of people. Because you're popular. I don't know why. So yeah, if people want to kind of try and get my attention, all the others like Michelle and Ian and Matthew can be looking for anyone there. Right, so I've got someone saying they can't switch on, so I'm now going to try and switch.
Darren.
So ask, yeah. So let me just see if I can do that.
Otherwise, Darren, type your question, and we'll read it from the chat.
So Darren, I'm trying to give you both of those things now. Hopefully that's worked. Can you try and see if they are working for me?
She was just saying she's unable to.
Sorry.
But Darren, you should share your experiences, because you have been working in this international development space.
See me now. Hi, Steph. Hi, Simon.
Particularly in skills and VET reform.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I do work in the development agency space, and I think for me, what is particularly frustrating is that these policies seem to be made, or the issues seem to come from Brussels in Europe. So, for instance, women's economic empowerment, digitalization, green TVET, entrepreneurship are all like big pressing issues. But then when you actually get into the field, I mean, I'm sitting in Ethiopia at the moment, and if you go to a college, I mean, they don't even have water in the women's bathrooms. They don't have internet connection. So I think that it's completely removed from the reality on the ground, and it's mainly focused on what's happening in Europe, which drives the development agenda.
Yeah, I think that is another additional problem. And it's additional, but also related, particularly in relation to the occupational standard issue, because I think, in many African TVET systems at the moment, people are very focused on developing occupational standards. And when they don't have water in the bathroom, and the people that I've engaged with have all said that employers aren't involved at all. But they also say that these occupational standards are what's going to make their VET labor market relevant, because it'll be employer-led. And they also say they're really hoping that the employers are going to start getting involved. And actually, that is what happened in the UK. I mean, UETKeep has written about it extensively. It was described as an employer-led system, and it wasn't employer-led. It wasn't what employers wanted. And yeah, employer-led systems, I think, are another example of policies that people kind of think do what's on the label. This is an employer-led system, so it must be led by employers, even though at best there's participation from an industry association. And often when the industry does send someone, it's an HR person from the industry. And in our context, often really knowledgeable people, but they're not in a company. They are in a training provider that's been training electricians for a very long time, or whatever it is. So yeah, so the focus on developing occupational standards, I'm picking that up on the what is in Brussels. Even if it isn't coming as a policy directive from Brussels, it is coming as this is what we see in Europe, and so that's what we need to have in our systems. I think Clara wants to say something.
Yeah.
She's just on screen.
Okay, great. And then I got Jocelyn after that. So let's do those two and then move from there to Clara.
Okay. Well, first of all, thanks very much, Steph, for the speech. That was really interesting. So I'm curious on what happens with policy feedback, or what the targets or beneficiaries, potential beneficiaries of any policy has to say about these things, or how is this feedback mechanism broken? What and how maybe it can be fixed? What is the role of research to fix the feedback loop? Because what I found puzzling is, okay, many policies keep failing, and we know, we may understand the reasons on the policy supply side of the thing, but how come the beneficiaries that end up not really benefiting from it or whatever are unable to speak? It's because they don't realize they have been failed, because what is happening? They are not heard. And which is the potential role of us as researchers in facilitating this?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's a really complex one, because I guess it depends on how you define the beneficiaries of any particular policy. So with employer-led VET, the beneficiary is supposed to be the employers who are going to get allegedly trained graduates who meet their needs, as well as the trainees who are going to get jobs, leading to economic growth. So, it's quite tricky to evaluate that. But what you do tend to see is systems that describe themselves as competence-based for years. And, I do think, Simon, that this is negative evidence. Describing the VET systems as irrelevant, despite the systems describing themselves as competence-based and employer-led. So that's one set of beneficiaries. But there are policies where the beneficiary is much more narrowly defined. And we find that the policies themselves don't have feedback loops for beneficiaries. And this is really the case if you look at qualifications and qualifications frameworks. So we did research in the SADC region looking at migration and how are migrants and refugees getting their skills and qualifications recognized. And none of the qualifications authorities had any mechanism for feedback from those people. We struggled to get hold of people to find out, what were their experiences. We got insights from, different groups. We got insights from employers. We got insights from unions. We spoke to a whole range of different organized bodies. But actually, these policies are supposed to help individuals, and they don't track whether the individual, it's the same thing for micro credentials and RPL. I interviewed a policy body in let me just say a Latin American country, who told me, we have issued RPL to hundreds of thousands of learners. We've given them certificates. So yes, that's what they're tracking. But what they couldn't say is it helped anyone to get a job, or it helped anyone to get promoted, or they had no idea. Now, those are hard things to track. But if you're not going to track them, you also can't claim that these policies help people to get jobs just because it sounds logical to you that it will. It might not. And there's lots of conceptual arguments against it. So, I think that many of the policy systems have very, very poor feedback loops to get actually feedback from how individuals are experiencing them. And there's not a lot of effort in actually setting that up. I mean, there's no effort, for example, in even finding out, so most countries are developing elaborate RPL systems, and it's expensive. It's really expensive to set up. Now, I'm not against RPL. I let students into my master's program through RPL, and many of them have done really well. But in a mass system is expensive, and what we don't have is any mechanism to say, is RPL needed? Who's looking for their certificates? In what sectors? At what levels? In which geographical regions? We don't have mechanisms to actually interface with people and find out how they experience the world and what they see there needs to be. So I think it's a really, really good point in terms of this kind of self-referential policy world that then evaluates itself on its own terms. How many certificates did we issue? Not did those certificates benefit anyone in any way?
Yeah, I think your very recent paper on workplace skills plans shows kind of again that in the kind of illogics of the internal logic. But Jocelyn has a challenging question. So, do you want to ask Jocelyn? Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, Steph, for the presentation. I can really relate to most of the things that you're talking about, especially when competency-based training is now being developed for the informal economy. I mean, it raises a whole lot of questions. But what I wanted to ask about relates to how we can engage with policymakers, especially when they think that we oppose their policies, because then it doesn't help with interactions. And again, how do we work with them when they're not prepared to invest in research, especially when they envisage the evidence is not going to be in their favor?
Yeah, no, it's a very tricky question, and I think there's no one single answer to it. It does depend. It differs in different political contexts. In our context, what I have tried to do over the course of my career in working in these policies and systems is really try to be as supportive as possible, but constantly pointing out the problems. And I think part of that is pointing out to policymakers where they don't need a policy for X. They just need to implement it differently. Or they don't need, so how can things be simplified? How can they actually just do things differently? But there aren't always simple solutions, and policymakers often get really irritated by researchers who find problems and point out complexity. And I can see that. I can understand their frustration. So I think it's a really tricky one, but I do think, particularly in the Southern context, now obviously there's authoritarian countries that don't listen to research at all and don't support any research at all. And obviously some contexts are much more resource strapped than others. But I do think that where possible, it is really important to build these kinds of relationships and to try to work with a range of different policymakers. And another thing that makes it difficult, though, in non-authoritarian contexts, is that there's so many policymakers, so many actors in our context, so many, different people trying to do different things and all pulling in different directions. And that becomes really challenging in terms of just like the basic reality of your time. So I really don't think there's simple solutions. And I'd love to hear how you guys have dealt with that in your context, Jocelyn and others.
Michelle?
Yeah, thanks, Simon, and thanks so much, Steph, for that really stimulating talk. My own research is on classroom pedagogy, but the resonances were incredible in terms of the whole issues around policy, the assuming something is complicated when actually it's incredibly complex, the feedback loops, everything that we've discussed seems relevant. And what I've kind of included in some cases, in the case of pedagogy, is that some of these policies are largely symbolic in the sense that governments want to be seen to be modernizing. They want to be seen to be doing something about the problem of learning. And so they give a nice, simple prescription without any actual intention of going through all the complexities of implementing it. And you know, I don't know how you understand whether they really have faith in it or not, but I just wonder, you know, I wonder what your reflections would be on that with regard to vocational education.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely the case. I think it's and I do, you know, and I say it with respect to the policymakers who do it, because I think sometimes, and it relates to Darren's point about the directives that come from Brussels, there's so many things to do and their job is so hard and they don't have a budget. And so, you know, if you develop occupational standards, it looks like you're doing something. And they're never going to be used. They're not developed by employers. The TVET institution has no idea what to do with them. But it feels like you're doing something to raise standards. It feels like you're doing something to improve relevance. So I think that policy symbolism is a huge issue. And that relates, I think, to Clara's point, because I think one of the things that we have to be helping policymakers to do is get the interface between the things that they are prescribing and developing and the real world and how people are experiencing them and what they're achieving. And I think that that's something that researchers can do and can help policymakers to see. But, you know, it doesn't make their job any easier. And I do think that, you know, sometimes they make policy because that's what they can do.
Talking about that question of making things easier for policymakers, supporting them capacity, Darren's got another question that I think is a really interesting one here. What can be done to strengthen the capacity of policymakers to implement? And I know, you know, you and I were part of labour market information programme and different things in South Africa that was supposed to be building capacity.
I mean, I think part of in our context in South Africa, and I'm not speaking for any other countries now, and other people can speak for other countries, there's quite a dislocation between the people who develop policies and the people who implement them. And I think that relates to what Michelle was saying. So, you know, it's quite, you know, you develop the new qualifications, you're not going to be involved in teaching them. You don't actually think through what the curriculum is going to look like. So it's in a way, yeah. I mean, maybe what they need to do is spend more time at the coalface. I do also think, though, and this is Heike's question that she posted in the chat about finding a solution to the problem. I do think that helping them to understand the problems is important. And that's why I think researchers that focus on the problems is important. It's really important to surface where the problems are. So, yeah, I mean, I just think that capacity is tricky, because capacity to do what? You know, our officials are always being capacity built, and have courses and study tours, and it's not clear what are the core capacities that they actually need and how do they relate to the work of the people who are implementing policy. But I'm not saying that we shouldn't strengthen capacity.
I think in that, you know, I was reflecting on that, you know, when we were part of very large initiatives to try and improve the system and capacity, there was a danger then, and I think when I was at Edinburgh, when we had a contract with DFID, a similar thing, that then you end up substituting for capacity a lot of the time because people are very busy in departments, and if there's a group who are supposed to be working with us, then hey, that's great, they can actually do that and do more of that work. And then Michelle worked in a part-time role in DFID as well as having her academic role, and I don't know what that experience was, but certainly, you know, having that well, kind of, why don't you do it then? Because, you know, you've got the capacity in that case in the Human Sciences Research Council to do the work in South Africa, so why, you know, why don't you do it? And you know, rather than handing it over to us, explaining to us and handing it over, you just do it.
Yeah, and I think that's a particular problem when new public management dominates the way the state operates, which is how our state was reformed. Because actually it puts policymakers in the position of just contracting everything out. And they're likely to contract out the policy development, contract out the policy evaluation, either decentralize or contract out the policy implementation. So, you know, building their capacity is neither here nor there. You've actually got to change what it is that they do before you build their capacity. And that's a complex problem, which I'm fortunately not in charge of solving.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the answers that you have given to what are complex problems. Given, you know, this is an international and comparative education space, I was reflecting on, you know, you were very much, you know, insisting on context there. But, you know, that strikes me as, you know, part of the problem of a lot of these policies. And, you know, in the UK system of or a tradition of international comparative ed, we tend to go back to Michael Sadler as our founding father. And his kind of famous thing about, you know, walking through the world like it's a garden and taking a flower from here and a leaf from there and putting them together and thinking you've got a plant, when of course you just have little bits of different things, seems to be, you know, very much at the heart of this. And a lot of the things you're talking about are bits of architecture that assume that there's a culture, and are often substituting for the fact that the culture isn't there. Well, if we build all these structures, then, you know, we'll build a culture from having all these different structures in place. But yes,
or the policy technologies.
Yes. You know, so we
start from them.
Yes. You know, so we have the technologies, but actually what we don't have is an ecosystem, to words you used earlier. So, you know, this strikes me as, you know, one of the big challenges thinking about this comparative. What does it mean when these policies travel? Of course, there's a big, you know, debate, because inevitably they come into different spaces around the world. But I say thank you very much for starting off this short series of seminars for us and being your usual lively and provocative self, and that was really great. And yeah, you know, if people want references to lots of those things, don't bother writing to Steph. ChatGPT will find for you.
It'll make some up for you.
Yeah, that'll be great. But no, you know, to engage this, you know, there is in this particular space, there's a lot of literature. Actually, Glasgow, as well as Wits, are major producers of that literature, and, you know, it's really good to be engaging with our partners. One thing I didn't say when introducing you is that, of course, you also have an honorary chair with us, and so we're very happy that that's the case. So thank you all. And the next session, I'm looking at Matthew. It is on, get my days right, Tuesday. Tuesday. Gita Steiner-Campsey, and I haven't got the title in front of me. But, you know, Gita, again, coming to many of these questions about how policy moves around the world, and how do we try and think about these things and be an interface between the policy and practice worlds. Because this, you know, as you've made very clear here, this isn't just about sitting there and critiquing policy from academia. That's easy. But of course, it's not very good because you don't understand the dynamics of it. Whereas when you have to advise the minister on what he should do on this thing, it gives you a much better sense of what the limitations and possibilities are of this world. So, you know, I think it's really important for us to think about how these things engage. And thank you, Matthew, for putting the details in the chat for this. Thank you, everyone, for attending. And thank you so much, Steph.
Cheers, everyone. Have a good afternoon, evening.